you'd like to put to Emil, you can just type them in the Q&A box. If you hover your mouse to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little box that says Q&A. Just type your questions in there, and then, as you think of them during the presentation, and then we'll cover them at the end. Okay, I'd like to just introduce Emil van Maltitz. He's an internationally recognized South African landscape photographer and a member of the International Environmental Photographers Association. He's also brand ambassador for Nisi Filtered and has been a finalist in International Landscape Photographer of the Year for 3 years. In 2017, received two bronze, two silver, and 1 gold award in the Epson Panoramic Awards. He's been involved in photography for the better part of the last 2 decades. After completing his postgraduate degree in anthropology, he opted to pursue his dream and turn his passion for photography into his career. Along with freelance, commercial, and assignment photography, Emil spends time running photographic workshops through Nature's Light. A particular interest of Emil's is the theory and practical application of advanced composition in landscape photography, which is usually covered along with teachings in Adobe Lightroom, Photoshop, and Capture One Pro on the workshops that he leads. So with that, I will hand you over to Emil. We're looking forward to it.
Right. I think I'm online at the moment. Can you hear me all right, Jeff?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go over to share screen. So host disabled. I need you to let me allow that first.
Yeah. Okay, I've done that.
Cool. Right. Just need to find this thing now. Sorry. Desktop 1. Let's do that. And I seem to have lost the presentation for the moment. Hang on a second. Right, can you see a screen over there?
Yes, it's in the landscape covered.
Perfect, right, okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for allowing me to come and talk this evening. I have to admit that the talk has kind of taken on various guises through the week, so I'm almost a little confused as to what I'm going to be saying so far this evening. But at any rate, hopefully I will be able to give you some ideas around some of my thoughts around landscape photography and the way it actually, it makes us see the world in a slightly different way, but also how we can elevate our landscape photography by bringing more than just the technical expertise and compositional sort of traits that we learn along the way. Okay, now landscape photography is one of the most popular genres of photography out there. We see photographs on our walls, as wallpapers on our computers. Even when we pick up a telephone, we see it usually plastered across as a screensaver somewhere. So landscape images have become almost commonplace everywhere we go. And it's also one of the first things that we want to learn to be able to take photographs. A large part of this has to do, of course, with the fact that when we pick up a camera for the first time and we want to learn how to take photographs, a landscape doesn't complain when we point our lens at them, whereas our spouse or our children or our friends, they tend to put up a hand and say, no, go away. So it helps having a subject that doesn't mind our gaze when we are looking at it. So regardless of this, though, we seem to be rather bad at it. There's a lot of really poor landscape photography out there. I say this only half jokingly because when we scroll through the multiple feeds of images that we're inundated with on a daily basis, we discover that there's not that many awesome photographs. There's a huge amount of really, really good photographs, but there's also a very large amount of not so good landscape photographs. Why is that when it's one of the genres that everyone shows such interest in and wants to do? So I have been thinking a little bit around this, and I'm going to also discuss how we can elevate our landscape photography so that it almost transcends the scene that we, oh, I'm supposed to actually be moving this about as I'm talking. Sorry, excuse the image is not necessarily moving. Now, one of the things that we first start to photograph, the very first thing we photograph is a sunrise or a sunset. And as a result, we see a multitude of sunrises and sunsets on our image feeds and in our photo books at home and on our hard drives and so on. It seems like we are the epitome of the sun worshippers. Every time the sun goes up in the east and sets in the west, there's somebody photographing it somewhere. It's gotten to the point that there are certain places that we go to that you'll have a phalanx of photographers standing next to you. So I do this jokingly, but I include a photograph of Moyo's Pier here, because every single morning that you go out there in Durban, I'm a Durban photographer. I understand we have photographers from around the country tonight, but every time you go down to Moyo's Pier, there is at least 3 or 4 photographers standing on the beach photographing this pier, which means that obviously there are a plethora of this particular composition sitting on the internet. And it doesn't matter if you move your angle a little bit, chances are somebody else has done that photograph. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it does prompt us to start to think, okay, how do we get out of the box where we're all photographing the same thing, doing the same composition? As nice as it might be, as pretty as the scene might be, how do we transcend the scene? How do we elevate our photography? How do we get it so that we're creating images that are mesmerizing, for want of better words, or at least that people are more likely to want to see, and not necessarily always flock to our photographic pill or our sort of little meccas wherever we might be. So now I can think of several examples like this, though. For instance, the amphitheater in the Drakensberg. This is a particularly common view that we see. It's most people who've been to the Royal Natal portion of the Drakensberg will know this particular view from just the side of the road towards Tindili campsite. There are other classic viewpoints, the Three Rondels and the Blyderveer Canyon from the upper viewpoint and the lower viewpoint, Table Mountain from Blauwbergstrand, to the point that we almost see the photograph before we've even gone there. So despite these obviously cliched examples, though, landscape photography is exciting. It's let's actually go back at one over there. Sorry about that. It's exciting. There's the chasing of light. There's the looking at the weather, wondering if everything's going to work out all right. The extremely technical nature of landscape photography as well. It lends itself to this excitement and this desire to improve our photography and to improve the images that we're wanting to capture. And when everything starts to come together, when the weather is right, when the light is coming from the right angle, when we've got that God ray coming through the clouds, everything starts to gel, and that feeling of nailing it, it's a euphoric feeling. So there's so you can understand why everyone wants to take these great landscape photographers. And it is also with that in mind that we realize why landscape photography is so hard. Okay, so this evening, I'm going to discuss a number of aspects to landscape photography and effectively how it changes potentially the way we view the world, as well as how we can change the world through our landscape photography to a small extent. I'm also going to look at the way that landscape photography can actually change our predisposition as to how the world should look. And this isn't necessarily a good thing. And then finally, I'm going to look at some core presets and how we can improve our photography and at least make it so that we are doing more than just Xeroxing the scene in front of us. Okay, so first I'm going to start with what I consider as landscape as a mindset, or landscape photography as a mindset. Now, landscape photography is more than a skill in the sense that we become fully immersed inside it. And we sort of develop this mindset towards the world as we move in it. Now, remember that we're all shaped by our own worldviews and our own ideologies and everything that you have around that. So obviously, the more we're in the landscape itself, the more we start to put those worldviews into our own photographs. This doesn't necessarily make sense at the moment, but as we go through the images, hopefully it will. Now, as a landscape photographer, if you spend any time out in nature, there is a good chance that you start to become more absorbed with the world around you, the minutiae of the detail that you're likely to come across. Do you get excited when the light pops out in a golden ray behind somber clouds, for instance? Do you get a sort of sense of anticipation when you can see the sun coming through a forest, for instance, and you can see the dappled light on the greenery and the foliage. Ordinary people or travelers who are walking through these kind of scenes or seeing these scenes don't necessarily get the same sense of excitement when they see these. Maybe certain artists do, but I feel quite strongly that landscape photography, the more you practice it, the more you start to obtain a greater appreciation for the world around you. You become almost sensitized to details, and I seem to have lost my camera, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. I'm not quite sure what happened there. Hang on a second. Sorry, apologies about that. I'm not quite sure what happened. Stop the oh dear. All right, I'm going to just shift to a different screen then. All right, hopefully you can still see me. I've just moved to a different screen, and with any luck that'll help. Sorry about that. And we'll just go back to play. Right.
Okay, all good again.
Sorry, technical issues. I apologize. Okay, where was I? All right, so I've changed to a backup, so to speak, on the webcam. Sorry. Okay. Right. I was going on about how do you get excited about the scenes around you and the way they look. And this is a good thing, because the further you fall down the rabbit hole that is landscape photography, the better you're going to be because of the way that we actually perceive the world. Okay, now, the way that I mean that landscape photography changes the way that you perceive the world is it's akin to, for instance, watching a sports game. And I know this sounds odd, but if you take a complete neophyte, somebody who's never watched a game of rugby, for instance, and you put them in front of a game and they say, watch, it's complete chaos. They don't understand a thing that's going on in front of them. Any sport that you have never seen, you're not necessarily going to understand. But somebody who has a good knowledge of that sport, of the intricacy behind that, the difficulty or indeed the beauty of a pass, for instance, they're going to gain a far greater appreciation for the sport and the play, for instance, because of their knowledge. It's the same thing as somebody who, let's say a naturalist or an avid birder, walking through a forest. If you know the names and the calls of a bird, you have a far greater appreciation for that bird. Otherwise, it's just a noise in the wilderness. And landscape images, I think, are very similar to that. Anybody can go to a great vista and be impressed by the scene that they see in front of them. And in fact, a lot of people will take their phones or a point-and-shoot camera, and they'll gaze it out or point it out at the scene, and they'll take a snapshot, a little picture to send back home and say, this is where I was. This is what I saw. A landscape photographer does it slightly differently. We go there and we tend to appreciate it in a far different manner. We're looking at it in a different way. We're appreciating it in a completely different manner as well. And we're doing more than just capturing an image that portrays that we were there. We're trying to do something else, which is what I'm going to be getting to as we go. All right, so landscape photography, by its nature in that case, is very definitely going to change the way that we view. And this is great because it creates a richer experience of the world around us. I feel wealthier for the fact that when I walk into a scene, I can't help but look at the details and consider all the niceties around me that other people might just walk straight past. So true photographers wander through the world with an eye bent on detail. For many people, this visual world it's full of noise. It's a hodgepodge of color and shape, and they only glean a certain amount of information from it. Whereas we tend to try to make sense of that information so that we can portray a story. And I'm going to talk about that story as we come to it as well. So at any rate, one of the things I've noticed is that landscape photographers are they're a danger to people around them because they walk into poles because they happen to be looking at a crack in the sidewalk. My children are terrified of the drive to school for the simple fact that I tend to have my attention dragged away by the Kranzkloof, which we have to drive past to get to their school every morning. And when the clouds are just right and the light is fantastic, I'm all for looking at that rather than the road. Not a good idea, I have to say. Okay, so as I say, landscape photographers can be a pain, which is why you need to travel with them and not other people. If you're a photographer, I mean. Okay, at any rate, in a similar vein, so nature photographers will look for details, as I've said. Would an ordinary beachcomber or person walking down the side of the coast take time to look at a pile of rocks? Probably, maybe not necessarily. Or cashew leaves on the side of the road. But a landscape photographer or a nature photographer, they do, to the point where they're trying to create order out of seeming chaos all the time. And again, this is how we perceive the world. It actually literally changes the way that we see it. Okay, now, of course, there is also a reportage or a journalistic endeavor to photography, and I'm not going to take away from that at all. But landscape photographers on a whole tend to try to portray the world in a way that puts across some kind of meaning, or at least the images that are elevated from just a plain photocopy of nature. They do tend to try and put across some kind of meaning, which is something that I would like to put across to people, is how do you put into your landscape images some sense, not only of the artist, but a story that you're going to be coming through. Okay, but does this necessarily help us create better images, particularly when we have the situation that there is such a glut of images that are already out there? I mean, if we look at, I think it was in 2017 or 2018, 17 trillion images were uploaded to the internet for viewing. Now, a whole lot of them were buff. We can agree on that straight away. It's there's people who spend their lives life logging, which is literally a little thing that goes around your neck, and you photograph every single second of your life, and that goes to the internet. So there's a whole lot of mundane dross and banality on the internet as well. But 17 trillion? That's an extraordinary amount of images. And in all of that, somehow we're supposed to find some kind of unique images, or some images that are perhaps a little more new. I don't know. Now, Michael Freeman puts it very nicely. He says, by nature, photography is simply mundane. There is no credit or surprise in simply getting likeness of the thing. And of those 17 trillion images that I just mentioned, a lot of them are simply a likeness of the thing. Okay, you don't get an award for that. So part of the problems that we as photographers face is that it is very, very easy nowadays to create a likeness of the thing. In the days of film, you needed some sort of technical knowledge to be able to portray the image, the scene in front of you as a straight facsimile of what we saw. Now, however, it's very, very different. Last year, I was in the Drakensberg with some friends of mine, and we had a playful little test where we took a photograph, and we were comparing the images between a Hawaii, a iPhone 11, and a Nikon D850. And I have to admit that when we looked up there, because we transferred all the images onto our phones because we can be technical nowadays, when we looked at the images, there was very little between them. And in fact, the cell phone images looked better. This image at the moment that you're looking at is a photograph taken from a cell phone, a Hawaii. And maybe it looks a little bit pixelated or granulated potentially, or maybe it looks fantastic, depending on your screen and the bandwidth, of course. And this was the version from the Nikon D850. The only time you really see the difference, though, is when you print it. It's when you look at it nice and large and you go into the image and you say, oh, hang on, there isn't noise, and I can actually see details in the rocks that you couldn't necessarily see with the phone. But the reality is that for a large part, we can get through the facsimile and even some of the creative aspects of photography simply by using a phone. It's no longer difficult. Which means that when we start to scroll through photographs, and of course, photography is now a very popular pastime, when we start to scroll through images on the internet, you start to see a whole bunch of very similar images. So this is just a quick glimpse of a search through 500 pics of Skogafoss, and it finishes up with 2 of my images. And my images were no different to the vast majority of photographs that were out there. So the images that stand out are those that have a particularly heavy-handed Photoshop or a quirky take on the traditional view. Images like mine they might have been fantastic 20 years ago, but now they join the ranks of images where you go, meh, it's not actually that impressive. So in some ways, landscape photography has been, it's had the misfortune of being inured to wonder, in the same ways that people are inured to violence or excessive political rhetoric. I don't need to point fingers or mention anybody over here, but it's as a result of this constant flow through the news and through film. We've become numbed to an extent to certain types of imagery. It makes me wonder about photography in the past, for instance. Some of you might be familiar with Stephen Shaw's work. Now, he worked particularly in the 1960s and the 1970s, looking at Midwestern America. And these photographs are lauded as a particular landmark style of photography. And he is one of the seminal writers and photographers of the last century. But now when you see the images, they look meh, for the most part. Why? Have we now lost, do images have to be so loud that you can see them on a cell phone from a mile away? Is that what we're now wanting to get out of our landscape photography? The Italian photographer Ugo Tse, he had a very good point in the sort of riff to Eminem, where he said, will the real landscape photographer please stand up? And indeed, this is sort of the case. The overuse of Photoshop, compositing techniques, and simply the chase to an artificially limited selection of, and I do mean artificially limited, because we have the world in front of us, but we all go to the same scenes all the time. But at any rate, this chase to the limited limited locations means that when we scroll through Instagram or Facebook or wherever your choice of images is, we see the same images again and again and again ad nauseum, and it becomes a situation of flick, 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 like, flick, like, flick, 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 like, and we don't actually stop for very long to actually look at the photographs. So although I'm proud of these images of dead flay that I've shot over the years, there's a certain sameness to them because we've seen these images again and again and again. But there's nothing wrong with that, because what we're also doing is we're creating for ourselves. And that is something that one always has to take away, is that we're not necessarily competing with the world outside there. Your landscape images are an extension of you as the photographer. So when you find that composition, it doesn't actually matter that somebody else has found the same composition at that point. Okay. Now, where am I on my notes? Sorry, pardon me. Something else that we need to be aware of when we do create these images, and it's going to come back later on when I start talking about the intent of images as well, is that there's a disassociation between perception and reality with our landscape photographs. Despite the fact that landscape photography is extremely difficult to obtain really good photographs, we're inundated with images on a daily basis of incredible places under amazing light. Almost too amazing in some ways. I mean, when we look at this photograph of these quiver trees in Namibia, do we ever really see quiver trees like this? Are our eyes being fooled by this? And yet, there's actually a situation, particularly in Europe, where people go on tours now and they complain that the Aurora Borealis doesn't look anything like the photographs that they were expecting. And it's because of the photographs. Landscape photographs have actually changed the way that we perceive the world and how we expect the world to be perceived. So if we look at a scene like this is Seljalandsfoss in Iceland, where we go on one of our workshops. This is a fantastic scene. It's not a particularly unique composition either, unfortunately. But the reality is very different to this. The reality of most people when they go there is this.
We've got a little bit of a planning
dreary, wet,
later,
cold.
Maybe it's not drizzling quite.
So in order to obtain this photograph, it required 4 separate visits on one trip. And this was photographed at about, I think it was just before midnight on the very last attempt to be able to get there. So already you can see that one of the takeaways is landscape photography. You just got to keep on going again and again and again and again. Keep reshooting the scene until you're lucky enough to be able to get the photograph itself. But for the most part, it does show that we often don't necessarily see photographs that we expect. How many people have seen the Milky Way like this, where you get the entire arc of the Milky Way across the horizon? It's unlikely, because only a camera is able to see that plethora of stars in the sky with that kind of brightness. And yet, because of the images that we see, you do find there are usually non-photographers who go out to a scene, and there is actually a sense of disappointment that they don't see what they've seen in the photographs. And again, I'm not saying that this is wrong, because I actually believe in bringing out an idealized version of a scene, or at least trying to obtain the essence of the scene as you would perceive it. I wouldn't say perceive it, as you experience it. And this is very important for landscape photography, is that you're actually trying to point out your experience, because you are telling a story. Similarly, this scene over here is Whale Rock, next to Hole in the Wall. Most people shift their angle slightly more to the right, and then they go and photograph Hole in the Wall. But this scene, yes, if we had extraordinary night vision, we'd be able to see this. But it's the result of a blend of photographs all at the same time. It's not necessarily artificial, but it is what the camera can see without our own eyes. So some people would say it's cheating. Some people would say, hey, it's all good. It's all fair. It's art. It's a landscape photograph. So it's your own personal take on that when you actually do look at those kind of images. Right, but that we naturally. Sorry, I'm losing my notes. Okay, the idea of whether it's artificial or not is a discussion for another time, at any rate. But when we start looking at photographs, landscape photographs that really are, they're up there as being those kind of images that they drill themselves into your head, that you remember at a later stage, and that they're the award-winning photographs that we talk about. There is something that I find very interesting, that when you gloss through the winning images in some of the top landscape salons, such as the International Landscape Photographer of the Year, the British Landscape Photographer of the Year, even Africa Geographic, the Nature Photographer of the Year, etc., you'll find that the winning images are often actually of unrecognizable places, not necessarily those locations that I mentioned earlier on, your quiver tree forest or your ice floe, Diamond Beach. They'll be of forests, potentially one that you've never seen before. But what they are showing is more of a meta scene, an every place, something that exposes more of a feeling than of the actual location itself. Because remember, landscape photography, as we tend to practice it, isn't creating a facsimile of the scene, it's telling a story. Okay, so they are often potentially very common scenes, just really well photographed. So yes, I fully agree that it is awesome to be able to go to a place like Madagascar and photograph baobab trees in the mist. It's an amazing experience, and it's not something that anybody should. You'd want everyone to experience this kind of thing, and it is phenomenal to be able to photograph it as a landscape photography. But you can also create mood-evoking images close to home. I mean, this is Montecille, photographed a few weeks ago. Now, Montecille is a 20-minute drive from where I am. I'd warrant that in any city in South Africa, within 1 hour's drive, you're going to find scenes that are worthy of any of the landscape salons around the world. Cape Town is particularly lucky, naturally, but we are too in Durban. Even in the Free State, I have had extraordinary experiences photographing, for instance, flat landscapes with this incredible sort of grass with amazing thunderclouds overhead coming in, scudding across the sort of November skies with their enormous cumulus clouds. So regardless of where you are, there is always a scene close by as a landscape photographer that you can actually image in the same way that those the award-winning photographs are taken of. It's always, though, about creating, again, going back to that idea of story. Just got to right, but so going back to the quiver trees. Oops, I don't know why that didn't go back to the quiver trees. Okay, anyway, I'll use this photograph over here. Going back to the quiver trees, yes, it is an iconic location that I was photographing, but it was more about the story that I was trying to create. Now, I'm not going to necessarily critique all the images that come across here, but my goal in the final photograph was to try to create a sense of time passing with these trees almost thrusting up from the ground beneath, reaching up to the clouds. And there's a sense that these are rain clouds scanning across the sky, across these, they look almost like skeletons, the trees coming up out of this hard, rocky surface. So there is a sense of story that I'm trying to create. Now, when I talk about story, I'm just going to spin through these over here again quickly. When I talk about story, I'm not necessarily saying that every viewer has to understand the story as you perceive it, but you need to start out by creating your photographs with a sense of the story in mind as you're doing. So what is story in an image? Critically, although it is a still image, the sense that there is something happening in the image is one of the reasons that, or one of the ways that we're able to make a photograph be more than just that facsimile, as I was saying. There needs to be a sense for the viewer that something is going on. And moreover, the viewer needs to wants to know about what's going on. They need to look at the photograph and think, I'd like to see more. I want to work through this image and figure out what is going on. So a successful photograph should leave more questions as it does give answers, or at least leave as many questions as it gives answers. Obviously, we're also adding to this a definite sense of mood and atmosphere, potentially a sense of movement as well. Now, that movement doesn't necessarily have to be, for instance, clouds scudding or waves crashing or anything like that. You can have a visual sense of movement simply by arranging the elements inside your composition so that your eye moves from point A to point B to point C, creating a visual flow through the image itself. So this is all how we work our compositions potentially. But the idea is that we want people to look at the photograph and say, it's more than just a picture. It's more than just a pretty scene. You want them to feel something when they're looking at those, or when they're looking at the photographs. So when you're looking, for instance, at an ocean or something like that, or oh dear, this didn't work quite as well as I wanted it to. When you're looking at, for instance, a scene of the ocean, you want them to feel like they can feel the spray coming off of the waves. You want them to feel the cold in the early morning. You want them to feel the warmth of the sun as it comes across them. So the idea behind a successful landscape photograph is that it evokes not just, for want of better words, a good-looking scene. It has to actually get the person to partly feel what's going on. Now, one of the simplest ways to do this is to change the angle. Okay. Now, when I talk about changing the angle, I mean, and I was very fortunate early on to start using drone photography, for instance, because it allows you to photograph a scene in a way that other people haven't necessarily seen it before. But this isn't for everyone, obviously. Drone photography as a start is difficult to get into. It requires licensing. Some places you're not necessarily allowed to shoot. But the point that it does make people realize, though, is that if you can create a photograph of a scene with a different angle, you start to be more successful. Now, if you look at this photograph of Kirkshire, the first time I went there, I hadn't really looked at many images of this particular location, and I was blown away. I was so excited. This is a unique image, I thought, until I got home and I looked at other photographs of the same scene, and it was just another version of the photograph. All the same. So there was nothing different to this photograph itself. So it got me thinking about that whole idea of create a different angle. This is Lisbon Falls, incidentally, and there's not that many photographs of Lisbon Falls with this particular panoramic view. In fact, I haven't seen any. I'm sure they're out there, but the idea is that when you are creating your images, you need to be cognizant of the fact that there is the standard view of an image, and then there is the view that evokes your sense of the scene itself. What is it that makes you excited? Why is the image interesting to you in the first place? Now, going back to the idea of the drones, it's that whole concept of create a different angle. Sorry, this was actually supposed to be prior to the previous slides, but at any rate. So when we're looking at photographs from the air or from a drone, it gives us that different view. So people are automatically wanting to view for longer. And I'm going to show you some ground-based photographs as well, which changes or flips the concept of creating images that you don't need a drone to be able to create an image of a different angle. And even without the drone, you can still do aerial photography from aircraft and helicopters. I've always been interested by it simply because it creates that different view, that different angle. Now, looking at or considering that different angle, when I was traveling again back to Namibia, I looked at the quiver trees, and there's all these photographs of quiver trees as we would usually see them. But not many people go right up to them and look at the bark itself. And the interesting thing about the trees is the bark. It's fascinating. It's one of the reasons why we find them so interesting. And yet everybody stands back as far as they could go and uses a wide angle lens to photograph them. And this is what I mean by angle. Look for the reason that is different to photograph it. Look for the reason why you're interested in the scene itself. And it's always more than just the view. It's going to also be something to do with the view. And using that as your center point, you're often able to create more interesting landscape photographs. So that little view is what drives the story. Now, there's obviously the physical changing of one's viewpoint when we look at photographs. So you could use a long lens, for instance, to change your viewpoint, or you can use a wide angle lens to change your viewpoint, or at least the scene that we're putting into the photograph. You can raise your height, lower your height to change the perspective towards your scene. All of these things are important. One of the last things I want people to do is stick their tripods up and shoot at eye level, because it's the same view that everybody sees. So if you're wanting your photographs to start telling a story, you need to actually start thinking about where's the angle that will actually create that story? Where's our viewpoint that is going to make people look at this in a completely different way, or in a different manner? So changing the angle is also going to change the way that people see the image, and therefore the scene itself. So now there are easy ways to do this, because of course when I talk about angle, I mean both physically and figuratively. So the angle could be, for instance, drag your shutter for a longer exposure so that you are able to give a greater sense of time passing, or perhaps open up your aperture a little bit more so that you can create isolation through the effective use of depth of field. These are technical skills that we can use, or technical traits of the camera and the imaging process, in order to tell the story or convey our emotions and our experience of the scene itself to the viewer who's watching who's looking at our images. So now to effectively compose, though, we also need to have a better idea of what the story is. What's the angle? And once again, that means entering a scene and not necessarily just suddenly thinking the scene looks interesting. You actually have to say to yourself, I want people to look down this avenue of trees like a tunnel that is being encapsulated by green foliage that is glowing. That pre-visualization of the scene itself is what's going to allow you to understand how to craft your image in the first place. It then dictates to you, this is where you stand. This is the aperture we're going to use. This is the processing technique we're going to use. But you have to see that at the time you're taking the photograph. If all you do is look at the scene and go, it's pretty, and put up your tripod legs and visualize the scene as it is, all you're doing is you're creating a facsimile of it. What we're wanting to do is evoke that emotion, that sense of wonder, potentially, when you actually see it for the first time. So without that understanding what your story is, composition is just an exercise in geometry. It's put this here, put that there. And worse, it's an exercise in geometry trying to fit the scene to your to the precepts that we've developed as rules of composition. Don't be afraid to break the rules. A lot of the images that I've shot don't necessarily follow any rules. One of the things that I tend to talk about is the concept of content-driven composition as opposed to rule-driven composition. So when I'm talking about find your story, you have to figure out what it is that you find most important inside the photograph and concentrate on that. So if I'm looking at this photograph at the moment of a forested lane, to me, the central composition here was very important. I wanted the sense of a canopy overhead. That's why there is more overhead view of the canopy than there is of the undergrowth. But then I also wanted the very definite sense of moving into the scene directly, so you're literally moving down the middle of the photograph. Now, if I'd gone via any sort of rule of thirds, this photograph would have fallen apart. It just wouldn't have worked. The story wouldn't have been there. You wouldn't see it in the same way. So content always should come first when you are thinking about your scene. And when I'm talking about content, you need to decide as a photographer, what moves me to think that this scene is interesting? Why do I think I like this photograph more than another photograph, for instance? Okay, so I'm just checking the time to make sure I haven't run out or anything. Why do we create images in the first place? Okay. I'm going to go almost full circle to the beginning of the talk, to when we started out photographing the sunrise. Now, there are many reasons that we initially pick up a camera and point it at something. For many of us, there is an imperative to record life's fleeting moments. We photograph our loved ones. We photograph a scene because we're traveling there and we want to remember it. And the places that we visit are important to us. Occasions that we celebrate, milestones that bring us together. It is interesting that the act of photography has become so ingrained in us, and this is in all people, everywhere, down to the cell phones that we carry with us all the time, that it's become a point where our cultures start to think that a moment in time isn't real unless it's been photographed. Susan Sontag actually points out that we fear that by not taking photographs, the scene will no longer exist. It's no longer there. It's a little bit like that old adage, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one to hear it, did it actually fall? If a moment happened in time and nobody was there to photograph it, did it actually happen? So now, but landscape photography, though, it's more than just a pursuit of capturing that moment. It's an artistic endeavor. It's a way of picturing the world. And it's important, I feel, to understand why we do this. What are the reasons for photographing, or what are the reasons or the intention behind creating these photographs? And this is also going to help us when we're trying to create our sense of story. Are we wanting to take a photograph for for social media? Are we wanting to take a photograph for a scrapbook? Are we wanting to take a photograph so that it is going to be printed large and placed on a wall somewhere that somebody in an armchair is going to stare at day after day, potentially week after week, if not year after year? Each of these different intentions is actually going to change the way we view our photographs. So what is the ultimate goal for your photograph? And that, again, you need to think about when you're actually out there with your tripod, looking at your scene and thinking, what's the story? It's important because it's going to help guide you in terms of the photographs that we're creating. Now, one of the best books I've read for quite a while, certainly I read it several years ago, was by the name has slipped my head now. I'll think of it in a moment. The Moment It Clicks. I'll come back to it now. But the photographer is talking about not understanding a scene that he was photographing, and he's panicking. Joe McNally. He's talking about photographing a light festival, a Hindu light festival in India, and he's overwhelmed by the noise and the atmosphere and the lights and everything going on around him. And the only thing that found his center in the end was when he started saying to himself, what's the story? What's the story? What's the story? What's the story? Almost like a mantra. And finally he was able to click. And by looking and coming up in his own mind's eye, what was the story that he was trying to capture, he was able to capture some really strong imagery as a result of it. When you step into a landscape, you need to say to yourself, what's the story? What am I photographing? Why am I photographing it? What is the reason for my wanting to photograph this? And please don't let it be because I just want to create a copy of this photograph or a copy of the scene. We're not photocopiers. We're not Xerox machines. A landscape photographer is an artist. I want to see the artist in the photograph. And this is interesting. If you look at somebody like Don McCullum, I don't know if many of you are familiar with his work, but he's one of the most lauded war or conflict photographers of our time, having covered the Vietnam War, early portions of the Korean conflict, I think, so the conflict in Northern Ireland, and then down to Sudan. And he's been around the world photographing trauma and dismay and heartache. You don't have to be a psychologist to think that that's going to affect you in some way or another. So now he's retired, and his landscape photographs are somber, dark, depressing, for want of better words. And it's not hard to see why that is. So you need to, the best photographs tend to be part of the photographer inside them as well. It's not just a scene. It's not just you're photographing for a client and getting their vision. It's your vision. And your experience of the world needs to come through. Obviously, this is going to be easier the more technical knowledge you have, so that you no longer feel hamstrung or confined by understanding ISOs and apertures and shutter speeds and which piece of glass should I put in front of my lens and do I need a tripod? When you are no longer constrained by the technical aspects, you can actually start to let your own emotions come through. When you find a scene extraordinary, awe-inspiring, and you have the technical knowledge to be able to convey that across as an image, then you will find that your images are going to be better for that fact. So I said right at the very beginning that landscape photography is a mindset. It's a way of viewing the world, and it helps us view the world as well. Ultimately, the power of the image remains in the story. Can we tell a story through the composition that we are creating? And this is where the artist lies. Our way of seeing the world is intimately tied up with how we photograph. If I look at a particular scene, it's because I'm interested in it. So your viewer is already going to get a better understanding of that scene simply by, or a better understanding of me, I should say, through the image that they have, that I have created. So to me, the takeaway from this evening should be the realization that good landscape requires that the photographer invests a little bit of themselves into the image. You cannot create a mesmerizing picture unless you yourself take an interest in the images, or at least the scene, the image yourself. If you are not interested in the scene, you're going to just create a facsimile. It's going to be a boring photograph. So you actually have to go out to a scene, put the camera down for a moment. Don't even think about picking it up. Look at the scene in front of you. I'm just going to take that back over there so we don't have to look at the thank you portion over there. Look at the scene that you are looking at, and just for a moment, figure out, why am I interested? Why do I want to take a photograph? What moves me? Why do I think this is worth photographing? If you can figure that out, that alone, and then you start to apply that to your composition, forget about, oh, I have to use rule of thirds, or I've got to have that leading line or that diagonal. If you just concentrate on what's the story, and you're able to put that across, your vision of the scene itself, is going to come across in the photographs itself. And hopefully, as a result, your image will transcend the scene. Right. I actually have no idea whether I've managed to keep within time limit or anything. I wasn't watching the clock at all. But thank you very much for listening.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, absolutely. She's so much food for thought and such a different perspective. And I certainly not one that I've ever really considered that much before. So a lot of food for thought. Thanks, Emil.
It is something that we try to on the various sort of like outings that I do and so on. We do try to spend a lot more time discussing sort of the philosophy of the photography itself, because like I mentioned, photography, once you get past understanding the technical stuff, and anybody can learn the technical stuff, it's just a matter of practice and patience and getting out there and shooting. Once you get past that, just the technical component, then it starts becoming more about the philosophy of the image and of the composition that you're crafting. And that's when masterful imagery happens. It's when you actually start to just be a bit more philosophical about the actual composition that you're trying to create.
Yeah. Okay. Great. There's one question. Do you use focus or photo stacking?
Right, yes, okay, we'll get back into the technical part. I do for certain images. I would like to be able to say, no, I don't at all, but I don't necessarily believe in this whole concept of the pure. Okay, let me backtrack a little bit. There's two sort of arguments to this. There's one set of photographers who are very militant about the fact that the image has to be purist and shot on the camera as is. Then there's another set of photographers who tend to say, no, we are visual storytellers. We're trying to obtain our emotion from the scene, or at least as we perceive the scene. Now, if you go back to the days of film, there was photo stacking even in the days of film. And in fact, the first photographer to have done it really effectively is a photographer by the name of Gustave Le Gray, who was a French photographer in 1880. So what he was doing is he was taking glass plate photographs, and he was taking images of a highlight scene and then a low light scene. So for instance, your shadows and your highlights. And then he was actually stacking the two layers of glass on top of each other and then printing them together. So stacking is nothing new. I mean, it's literally 140 years old. And people then go, oh, but it's digital, it must be fake. It's not true. We can get into this long philosophical argument about what is true or what is not. So I tend to look at a scene and go, if I see the scene in a certain way, so I can see detail in the clouds and I can see foreground detail, and I want that to come across in the photograph, but I can't achieve that with filters. Well, usually I can, but if I can't achieve that with filters, then I will photo stack. If there is a depth of field issue in the photograph where I want you to be able to see, for instance, shards of glass in the foreground all the way through to a mountain in the background where everything is pin sharp, I could achieve that in a single photograph if I had a large format field camera, but I don't. So I will use stacking to be able to do depth of field stacking in that case. It's the same thing with panoramic shooting. I don't have a great big Linhof Tech card-on camera that can shoot 6x17 plates. So instead, I'll take my camera and I will create a panoramic stitch, which is also stacking in a way. So I'll use the tools that are available to me to be able to basically create the photograph that I envisage when I walk in there. And yes, I do see the world through rose-tinted glasses, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay, well, well, there is another question I'll just jump to, which I think you've answered now, and also looking at the Nisi filters that you do distribute is, do you use graduated filters or polarizer filters, and do they help get better exposures?
A lot, yes. So if you're in the Durban area, we do run various Nisi demo workshops and so on that are free to join, so you can actually see how they work. And I know that down in Cape Town, Hooghart Milan is very active with the Nisi South Africa workshops and so on. So you can actually go along and just see how they work. But basically, going into the technical basis of a digital sensor, the problem is that despite the enormous dynamic range that we're able to achieve with our sensors, and I mean, we're up to 13 stops of dynamic range, which is just insane. But the problem is that the fall off from your highlights to your shadows is so abrupt and sudden that you have a very ugly transition between your highlights and your shadows. With film, we were able to get away with it because there was a very gradual, non-linear fall-off, which was actually quite pleasant. So you could take a photograph that had a blown-out sky, and it was fine. Didn't actually matter, because the way that film imaged light, you had a gradual tail-off, so it was actually quite pleasant. Whereas digital, there's no such thing. It's just light, dark, with a hard transition between them. So yes, filters do make a big difference when you use them. And it's the same with polarizers. I know that there's some well-known photographers in South Africa who eschew the use of polarizers because they say that it isn't natural. But for me, walking in a forest, when you use a polarizer, it just creates this extraordinary, it's this lush feel to the scene where you start seeing these beautiful, beautiful greens coming out, and the forest starts to take on a color that we can't necessarily see with our eyes, but we certainly feel it. I mean, you've had that sense when you walk into a forest where you feel almost like you're entering this mystical land. And then you take a
Yeah.
photograph with your phone and you go, that's not what I feel. It doesn't look like it. So I tend to try to create a photograph that is closer to how I imagine the scene when I walk inside it. And as I said, I do see the world through rose-tinted glasses, or at least landscapes. And actually, coming back to that, that's an important way of seeing the world. If you look at, and obviously it's a landscape talk, so we have to mention Ansel Adams. But if you look at Ansel Adams' photographs, a lot of them are very highly manipulated. And it was because he was trying to show a idealized vision of the scene itself. It's not how you would see it in real life necessarily. So, but yes, filters from a purely technical point of view will help you obtain a better exposure that you can then work either if you want the image straight off because you're shooting a JPEG, or because you need more data on your sensor because you are going to be adjusting a raw file.
Okay, and then another question is what gear? So what other gear do you use? What's your basic main gear?
Whatever I've got really. my current camera that I really love, it works really well, is a Nikon D850. So I haven't gone across to the mirrorless format just yet for various reasons, cost being probably the primary reason behind it. As much as I like to think of myself as a landscape photographer as well, I don't make my living out of landscape photography. The Scottish have a wonderful saying where they say you can't eat a landscape. So a lot of my work is done commercially for clients doing product photography, commercial industrial photography. So I need a camera system that can bounce between doing landscape photography as well as all the other stuff that I do to fill the pot. So the Nikon D850 has been the camera of my choice, but that's not to say that that's the best camera out there. Canon produces some extraordinary cameras. I've been constantly tempted by Sony's systems as well, simply because they're so nice and light until you pick up one of their lenses, of course. And the Sony lenses are also rather dear. They're quite expensive. In terms of other equipment that I use a range of lenses from a Laowa 12mm ultra wide. I also have the new Laowa 100mm macro lens. I've got various other wide angle lenses. My favorite lens is an 18mm Zeiss, which I got strong armed into buying several years ago and fell in love with after a sort of hit and miss affair with it. Great lens, so now I love it. I use a 70-200 lens, is one of my money lenses. I think it earns a lot of my keep, so to speak. I use tripods, Leo Photo, partly because not partly, I fell in love with their equipment a while back and became an ambassador shortly thereafter. They are for their cost, I think, one of the best tripods around. And certainly South Africans can appreciate the price point, because when you start comparing them to some of the international brands like Really Right stuff, they're just same quality, but literally a third of the price. So it's one of the reasons why I follow Leo Photo. In terms of lighting, I use a lot of Godox equipment, again, because of price. And then Nisi, I fell in love with Nisi a while back. I used to be a Lee photographer, to the point that through a colleague of mine in the UK, I was able to actually get directly from Lee as what they called a Lee preferred professional. And then several years ago, I did a test between Nisi and Lee and grudgingly discovered that Nisi was optically superior, and slowly started using it more and more and more and more until Hercard Milan of Landscape Gear sort of said, well, you keep saying that you're a Lee photographer, but you've only bought Nisi glass from me for the last year. Would you like to become an ambassador? At which point I realized that I didn't have any Lee filters left, even though I was calling myself a Lee photographer. So I use Nisi glass on a lot of my landscape photographs.
Okay, great. And then just one other question, and I'll go through some comments. Lightroom or Photoshop?
Okay, I had a hissy fit with Lightroom several years ago when their catalog had me waiting 15 minutes to open the images, and I moved across to Capture One, and I'm a very, very happy convert to Capture One. I still teach Lightroom, so I've had to stay au fait or current with it, but I find that for the work that I do, Capture One is extraordinary. I love it, and it's minimized the amount of Photoshop work that I do But having said that, I'm in Photoshop on a daily basis, whether it's for the commercial work that I do or for the landscape stuff that I shoot. Nothing has really replaced luminosity masking for doing unique edits to your images. So although I will try and do as little as possible to a photograph, I do find that, for instance, sculpting clouds so that you can get your clouds so that they have that pop, or just back to what you saw for that matter, or what you felt. I think Photoshop it's a tool that everybody needs to learn how to use. Now, that's not necessarily that you have to use Photoshop. There are actual other versions out there, so you don't have to go and pay that tax to Adobe. I'm lucky. I can pass it off as a tax-deductible expense because I make my living out of photography. But for a lot of photographers out there, that $11.50 a month it's painful, particularly the way the rand is going. So there are other options out there. Affinity Photo is fantastic. I've played with it a couple of times. It gives you everything Photoshop would give you. GIMP is still there. It's still a free option for a lot of people. And then there's another Mac version. I'm trying to remember. It's not Affinity Photo. It is, if it comes to me, I'll think of it in a moment. But I think I did a review on it on Photo Writing, which is the blog that I run. So anybody's welcome to go there. And incidentally, I'm always open to discussions, and I get a kick out of meeting like-minded people who are passionate about photography, which is why I enjoy the workshops and stuff as well, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I must just read some of the comments here. Great talk, Emil. Amazing pictures. Dinesh Kara, Jan Enslin, Emil, fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Linda Penny, fabulous session. Thank you. Corin van der Meest, fantastic enthusiasm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Catherine, thanks for a great talk and insights. Evan Gibson, wow, I love this philosophy and it speaks loudly to me, as landscape photography is one of my favorite genres. Thank you for this new way of thinking. Great food for thought.
Cool, thanks.
And certainly concur with that.
Cool, thanks. I must remember, I've been, on pain of death, I've been told I have to mention this. Starting as of the 1st of November, any place that you do go to that deals with Nisi, you can get a discount on any Nisi glass apart from the Cine range. So you can go into Joburg or Cape Town, or you can also deal with me directly if you would like, or Photo Freedom. There is a 15% discount on all Nisi glass. That's what's being told by the internationals. It's what we're allowed to advertise, but you can get more. You can actually get a full 20%. I've said, just give me the code PSSA, but you can have a little chat certainly to me, through the month of November. It's not a Black Friday thing. It's a November special. It's 20% off all Nisi glass. So this is a really good opportunity at the moment, particularly as the rand has meant that Nisi is rather pricey at the moment, unfortunately, along with every other photographic piece of equipment.
All right, great, thanks. And then we'll just one last question. Yeah, that's a fantastic offer, Emil. Thanks very much. And then the other question is on image processing software, DxO.
DxO, really good. Oh. Again, I've played with it. I've been very impressed by it. I took out a trial version. I was very impressed. So the thing is, there's so many platforms out there now that you've actually got to go and try them yourselves, unfortunately. The bad thing is I find that 30 days is not a long enough trial period. You actually need 2 months minimum. I found that even with Capture One, when I first went over to it, I got in the end, I almost felt strong-armed into using it because 30 days wasn't enough to really assess it. And it was the same with DxO. I played with it, I liked it, but it gets to the point where there are so many programs and applications out there that you almost have to say, you almost look at it and you can't use all of them. There's just too much. So I have stuck with, for instance, NickFX, which it's owned by DxO now. And I do use it on quite a few of my images, but you don't necessarily have to have every single piece of software out there because there's other things as well. Luminar, DxO, Topaz, you name it. There's so many different programs. So what my feeling is choose the software you want to use and get to master it. Don't necessarily feel that the grass is greener on the other side. It isn't necessarily. After I'd made my switch to Lightroom, they improved certain aspects. I could have stayed within Lightroom. I might have been happy. But I'd made my switch, and I was happy with my switch after that. I don't ever feel, ooh, the grass is better over there. I've got to jump across to that. So DxO Optics is fantastic, and there are some certain things inside there that I was really impressed with. In the same way that when I looked at, I'm trying to think of the other one. Well, Luminar is another one of them, where I looked at it and thought, this is great. This is really nice. So there are some very, very competent tools out there that you can play with, but don't feel bogged down into having 3 million applications on your computer. You don't need them.
Yeah.
And as it is, if you want to go free, I was playing with Darktable the other day. It's fantastic. It actually has aspects to it that Capture One doesn't have, neither does Lightroom nor DxO Optics. So there are even free versions out there. You've just got to take the time to learn them, and that's the hard part.
Yeah, I think it's like you say, you can get so bogged down in equipment and software, etc., you forget about the actual photo, which comes back to your theme. What is the story?
Enough, I actually read about that the other day with another photographer who's commenting on that, saying that this striving to have the newest camera as soon as it comes out actually detracts from your image making, simply because we need to now learn a new camera. I find that I only start to take my best images with a camera after I've had it for about 6 months. Prior to that, I'm just fighting it, because I'm still learning about its sensor. I'm still learning about even just working the camera so that you can work with it blindfolded, knowing where all the buttons are and the menus. It takes time. So when you jump from Canon to Nikon to Sony, because each single time a new camera comes out and you think, hey, this is the best thing I've ever since sliced bread, you're actually doing yourself a disservice. You are you're losing sight of what's important about the image, which is the image, not the camera.
Great. Well, okay. Emil, thanks again very much. It was a fantastic talk. We really, really enjoyed that. So thank you very much.
Cool.
And yeah, look forward to being in contact with you again.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you. I have no idea how many people are out there, actually. I see
a few.
4 blocks.
There's about 150.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. That's probably the biggest talk I've given in that case.
Fantastic. All right, everyone, we'll take a short break again. It's just after 8, so at 10 to 8, we'll come back, and then we're going to run through, well, Jill Sneesby is going to run through the honours.